1. The Whispering Pines. It was the beginning of fall when Claire and her friends set out to hike a remote section of the Appalachian Trail. The crisp air and the golden leaves painted a picture-perfect scene, but as they ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere grew heavy. The group had heard about the eerie tales of the Whispering Pines, a part of the trail known for its unsettling phenomena. On the second night, as they set up camp, the forest fell silent. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by an unnerving stillness. They dismissed it as a natural quiet, attributing it to the season. As they gathered around the campfire, they started hearing faint whispers. At first, they thought it was the wind playing tricks, but the whispers grew clearer, almost like voices speaking in hushed tones. One by one, the group began to hear their names being called. Claire's friend, Mark, claimed he heard his name distinctly and went off into the woods to investigate. Despite calling out for him, he didn't return until hours later, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. He insisted he saw shadowy figures among the trees, whispering his name. The next morning, the group found strange symbols etched into the ground around their campsite, symbols they couldn't recognize. As they packed up to leave, the whispers continued, now coming from all directions, filling their ears with incoherent murmurs. Terrified, they hurriedly made their way off the trail, vowing never to return. Weeks later, Claire researched the area and discovered that the Whispering Pines were rumored to be haunted by the spirits of those who had gone missing in the woods over the decades. The whispers were said to lure hikers away from the path, leading them to a fate similar to those lost souls. 2. The Phantom Hiker. James was an experienced hiker and had traversed many trails without incident, but the Appalachian Trail had always eluded him. One autumn, he decided to tackle a particularly isolated segment. He was drawn to the solitude and the challenge, but he was unaware of the local legends about the Phantom Hiker. The first day of the hike was uneventful, and he camped near a small stream. That night, as he was drifting off to sleep, he heard the distinct sound of footsteps approaching his tent. Thinking it was a fellow hiker, he called out but received no response. The footsteps continued, circling his tent in a slow, deliberate manner. When James finally ventured out with his flashlight, he saw nothing but the stillness of the night. The next morning, he noticed that his food supplies had been rummaged through, but there were no signs of animals. The following night was eerier. He awoke to find his tent's zippers undone and a cold breeze cutting through. The phantom footsteps returned, more persistent and closer. Each time he checked, the area around him was empty. This cycle continued for the next few nights, each time feeling more intense and threatening. On the last night, James saw a figure in the distance. A man dressed in old-fashioned hiking gear, seemingly from another era. The figure was walking slowly and deliberately, with a ghostly, transparent quality. James tried to approach him, but the figure vanished before he could get close. Terrified, James packed up his gear and left at dawn. Upon his return, he learned about the Phantom Hiker, a spectral figure seen by those who ventured too deep into the wilderness. The story went that the hiker was a lost soul, eternally searching for a way out and leading others into the same fate. James never spoke of his experience publicly, but he knew that the Phantom Hiker was not just a myth. The unsettling presence he felt and the spectral figure he saw would forever haunt his memories. 3. The Vanishing Cabin. During a solo hike in a lesser-traveled section of the Appalachian Trail, Emily stumbled upon an old, seemingly abandoned cabin nestled in a secluded clearing. The cabin looked like something out of a forgotten era, its wood weathered and covered in moss. Intrigued and seeking shelter for the night, Emily decided to stay. The inside of the cabin was surprisingly clean, with a dusty but intact bed and a fireplace with a stack of old firewood. As night fell, Emily settled in, feeling a strange sense of comfort in the eerie solitude. The night was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the cabin. Around midnight, Emily was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps outside. Thinking it might be other hikers, she called out, but there was no response. The footsteps continued, growing louder and more erratic. She checked outside through a crack in the window but saw nothing. Suddenly, the cabin's door creaked open and a cold wind swept through. Emily tried to close the door but found it was stuck. The temperature inside plummeted and she could see her breath. Then she heard whispers, voices mumbling incoherently, coming from all directions. Terrified, she packed her things and tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. As she looked around in desperation, she noticed strange symbols on the walls, similar to the ones found in folklore about haunted places. Just as she was about to panic, the door flung open on its own. Emily rushed out into the night, running back to the trail. She didn't stop until she reached the nearest ranger station, where she learned that there were no records of any cabin in that area. It was as if the cabin had vanished overnight. Emily never found out what happened that night, but she was left with the unsettling feeling that the cabin was not just a relic of the past, but a gateway to something far more sinister. 4. The Cursed Ridge. Tom and his hiking partner, Lisa, were veterans of the Appalachian Trail and were excited to tackle a particularly challenging ridge known for its panoramic views. They had heard about the trail's beauty, but also its reputation for mysterious occurrences. On the first day of their hike, they noticed an unsettling feature of the ridge: a series of old, rusted metal objects and broken-down structures scattered among the rocks. Despite the oddity, they pressed on, eager to reach the summit. As night fell, they set up camp at a flat area they thought was safe. The ridge was exposed, and the wind howled through the night, making sleep difficult. Around midnight, Tom woke up to the sound of someone or something moving around their campsite. He'd heard heavy footsteps and rustling noises, but saw nothing when he looked outside the tent. The next morning, Tom and Lisa discovered that their food supplies were disturbed and some of their gear was missing. They continued their hike, but Lisa began to feel increasingly uneasy. She felt as though they were being watched and heard faint, distant whispers on the wind. When they reached the top of the ridge, the view was breathtaking, but the atmosphere was strangely oppressive. As they took in the scenery, they noticed what appeared to be a shadowy figure watching them from a distance. The figure seemed to shift and change shape, always just out of reach. That night, the wind picked up even more, and the whispers grew louder. Tom and Lisa felt an overwhelming sense of dread and decided to leave the ridge early. As they descended, they encountered strange markings on the trail, symbols similar to those found in old local legends about cursed places. Back at home, they researched the area and found that the ridge had been the site of several unexplained disappearances over the years. Some locals spoke of a curse placed on the land by indigenous tribes who believed the ridge was a gateway to another world. Tom and Lisa never returned to that part of the trail. The experience left them with an unsettling reminder of the unknown forces that might linger in the wilds, waiting to ensnare the unwary. 5. The Ghostly Hiker. Evan and Sarah were an adventurous couple who had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for years. They'd prided themselves on their knowledge of the trail's nuances and were confident in their ability to handle any situation. However, their confidence was tested when they decided to explore a lesser-known section that had a reputation for being haunted. On the second night of their hike, they set up camp near a small, isolated lake. The area was peaceful, but there was a pervasive feeling of being watched. As they settled in for the night, they noticed a figure in the distance, standing still by the edge of the lake. The figure appeared to be a hiker, but there was something odd about it. Its features were indistinct, and it seemed to flicker in and out of view. Curious but wary, Evan decided to investigate. As he approached, the figure turned and walked away, heading into the dense woods. Evan called out, but the figure did not respond. He followed it for a short distance, but lost sight of it among the trees. When he returned to camp, Sarah was visibly shaken. She had heard strange noises while Evan was gone, including what sounded like distant, ghostly cries. They decided to pack up and leave early, but their night was far from over. Throughout the night, they were plagued by a series of unsettling occurrences. Their tent was unzipped multiple times, and they heard whispers and footsteps around their campsite. The figure they had seen by the lake seemed to be moving through the trees. Its presence felt more than seen. The next morning, Evan and Sarah found fresh tracks leading away from their campsite, but there was no sign of the mysterious figure. When they returned home, they researched the area and discovered that several hikers had reported seeing a ghostly figure near that lake, a hiker who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances years earlier. Evan and Sarah never spoke of their experience publicly, but the eerie memory of the ghostly hiker lingered in their minds, a reminder of the unseen dangers that can lurk in the wilderness. 6. The Echoing Cabin. In a remote section of the Appalachian Trail, there was a dilapidated cabin that had long been abandoned. It was known among locals as the Coin Cabin due to strange acoustic phenomena reported by those who ventured too close. The cabin was said to be cursed, and most hikers avoided it altogether. Jack, a seasoned hiker, was determined to spend a night at the Coin Cabin as part of his quest to uncover the truth behind the legend. He arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon and immediately noticed the eerie silence that surrounded the area. The cabin's windows were boarded up, and the door was barely hanging on its hinges. As night fell, Jack made a fire in the old fireplace and settled in. The wind howled outside, and the cabin creaked with each gust. As he sat by the fire, he began to hear faint echoes of voices, muffled and distant, as if coming from another time. The echoes seemed to repeat phrases and sentences in a disjointed manner, growing louder and more insistent. Jack tried to ignore the sounds and went to bed, but the echoes continued, now mixed with whispers and footsteps that seemed to come from inside the cabin. He felt as though he was not alone, and the eerie feeling intensified when he heard his own voice being echoed back at him, distorted and unnatural. Unable to sleep, Jack decided to investigate. He searched the cabin but found nothing unusual. The echoes persisted, becoming more chaotic and unsettling. Jack felt a growing sense of dread and decided to leave. As he packed up his things, the echoes became a cacophony of voices, seemingly pleading and screaming. When Jack finally left the cabin, the echoes stopped abruptly, leaving him in an unnerving silence. He learned later that the cabin had once been the site of a tragic event, a group of hikers who had been lost and eventually perished in the area. Their voices were said to linger, echoing through the cabin as a form of supernatural residual energy. Jack never returned to the Coin Cabin, and he shared his story with few. The experience left him with a profound sense of unease and a belief in the lingering presence of those who had met a tragic end. 7. The Haunting of Devil's Kettle. Lena and Mike were experienced hikers who decided to explore the infamous Devil's Kettle, a part of the Appalachian Trail known for its treacherous terrain and unsettling legends. The name alone evoked tales of supernatural occurrences and mysterious disappearances. The couple began their hike early in the morning, making their way through dense, dark woods. The path became increasingly difficult, with steep inclines and rugged terrain. By evening, they reached a clearing with a small, gurgling stream that led into a deep, dark hole known as the Devil's Kettle. The hole was said to be bottomless, with no one knowing where the water disappeared. As night fell, Lena and Mike set up camp near the stream. The air was unusually cold, and an eerie fog began to roll in. They tried to shake off the feeling of unease as they made dinner, but the atmosphere was heavy and oppressive. As they sat by the fire, Lena noticed a figure standing on the opposite side of the stream. The figure was barely visible through the fog, but seemed to be watching them. Mike, dismissing it as a trick of the light, went to investigate but found nothing. Lena was increasingly disturbed by the figure's presence, feeling a growing sense of dread. Throughout the night, they heard strange noises coming from the direction of the Devil's Kettle, whispers, rustling, and an unsettling gurgling sound that seemed to come from deep within the hole. The noises grew louder and more chaotic, and the figure reappeared several times, always watching from a distance. Unable to sleep, Lena and Mike decided to leave early. As they packed up, the fog thickened, and the temperature dropped even further. They felt an overwhelming sense of being watched and followed. As they made their way back down the trail, they encountered several other hikers who reported similar experiences of seeing shadowy figures and hearing strange sounds around Devil's Kettle. Later, Lena and Mike learned about the tragic history of the area. The Devil's Kettle had been the site of numerous unexplained disappearances, and locals spoke of restless spirits and malevolent entities that haunted the place. The chilling encounter left Lena and Mike with a deep-seated fear of the Devil's Kettle and its dark, mysterious reputation. 8. The Legend of the Lonesome Hunter. During a solo hiking trip, Rachel decided to explore a remote segment of the Appalachian Trail known for its solitude and rugged beauty. The area was sparsely visited, and Rachel relished the chance to immerse herself in the tranquility of the wilderness. On the second night of her hike, she set up camp in a small, secluded clearing surrounded by dense forest. As she settled in for the night, she noticed an old hunter's cabin in the distance, partially obscured by trees. The cabin looked abandoned but seemed oddly intact. As Rachel prepared her campfire, she heard distant gunshots and the sounds of someone moving through the woods. Given the remote location, she was puzzled by the noise. She decided to investigate and approached the cabin. It appeared empty, but there were signs of recent use, fresh tracks, a dusty old rifle propped against the wall, and a pile of old hunting gear. Rachel felt a sense of unease but dismissed it as paranoia. She returned to her camp, but the noises continued throughout the night, footsteps, rustling, and the occasional distant cry. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and she had trouble sleeping. The next morning, Rachel found an old journal near the cabin. It belonged to a hunter who had lived in the area decades earlier. The journal recounted strange experiences and sightings of ghostly figures in the woods. The hunter had become increasingly isolated and paranoid, eventually disappearing without a trace. The final entries spoke of a haunting presence that drove him to madness. Disturbed by the journal's contents, Rachel packed up and left immediately. As she hiked out, she noticed the cabin was no longer visible and felt a chilling sense of being followed. She learned later that the area had a reputation for strange occurrences and had seen several disappearances over the years. Rachel's experience left her with a haunting memory of the lonesome hunter, a ghostly presence that seemed to inhabit the old cabin and the surrounding woods. The encounter reminded her of the thin line between the natural world and the supernatural, and the eerie legacy that lingers in the remote corners of the Appalachian Trail. 9. The Shadow of White Rock. Jamie and his friends had always been drawn to the rugged beauty of the Appalachian Trail, and they were excited to explore a particularly remote section known as White Rock. This area was famous for its stunning rock formations and sweeping vistas, but it was also reputed to be haunted by a mysterious shadow. On the first night of their hike, the group camped near a large rock formation that resembled a white, jagged spire. The weather was clear, and the stars shone brightly, but there was an uneasy stillness in the air. As they settled down for the night, Jamie noticed a strange shadow moving across the rock, even though there was no discernible light source to cast it. At first, they thought it was a trick of the light or a play of shadows, but the shadow seemed to move deliberately, shifting and changing shape. It appeared to take on the form of a human figure, although it was indistinct and flickering. The group tried to dismiss it, but the shadow's presence was unnerving. Later that night, Jamie woke to find the shadow moving closer to their campsite. The figure seemed to grow more distinct, with what looked like ghostly, outstretched arms reaching towards them. The group was frightened but decided to stay put, hoping the shadow would disappear by morning. By dawn, the shadow was gone, but the feeling of unease lingered. As they packed up, they discovered strange markings on the ground around their campsite, symbols that none of them recognized. They'd also found that some of their gear had been moved, although nothing was missing. When they returned home, Jamie researched the area and found that White Rock had a history of strange occurrences. Local legends spoke of a shadowy figure that appeared to travelers, leading some to believe it was the spirit of a long-lost hiker who had perished in the area. The figure was said to be searching for something, or someone, forever trapped in the shadows of White Rock. 10. The Lost Camp of Raven's Hollow. Samantha and her brother Alex had always been fascinated by the stories of Raven's Hollow, a remote part of the Appalachian Trail known for its ghostly legends and eerie atmosphere. The hollow was rumored to be the site of a lost campsite where a group of hikers had vanished without a trace years earlier. Determined to explore the area, Samantha and Alex set out on their hike with high hopes of discovering something extraordinary. They arrived at Raven's Hollow in the late afternoon, finding the landscape to be both beautiful and foreboding. The hollow was surrounded by dense trees and thick fog, giving it an otherworldly appearance. As they set up camp, they noticed remnants of an old campsite, faded campfire rings, broken tents, and discarded gear. The site appeared abandoned, but there were signs that someone or something had been there recently. The atmosphere grew colder and the fog thickened, shrouding the area in a veil of mystery. That night, Samantha and Alex heard strange noises coming from the surrounding forest, distant voices, whispering winds, and the occasional snap of a twig. The sounds seemed to be moving closer to their campsite. They decided to investigate and followed the noises into the fog. As they ventured deeper, they found an old, decrepit cabin hidden among the trees. The cabin was in disrepair, with broken windows and a rotting door. Inside, they discovered old, rusted camping equipment and a journal with entries from the missing hikers. The journal spoke of growing fear, strange occurrences, and a feeling of being watched. The final entry mentioned something about the watchers in the fog. Suddenly, the fog outside thickened, and they heard the sound of footsteps approaching the cabin. Panicked, they fled back to their campsite, only to find that their gear had been moved and their tent partially dismantled. The feeling of being watched intensified, and they decided to leave immediately. As they hurried out of Raven's Hollow, they encountered several other hikers who reported similar experiences of hearing whispers and seeing strange figures in the fog. The legend of the lost camp persisted, with locals believing that the hollow was haunted by the spirits of the missing hikers, forever trapped in the foggy embrace of Raven's Hollow. Samantha and Alex left with a deep sense of unease, their encounter with the eerie legend of Raven's Hollow a haunting reminder of the trail's darker mysteries. 11. The Phantom of Old Mill Creek. In the heart of the Appalachian Trail, Old Mill Creek is known for its serene beauty and historical significance. The creek runs through a forested area with an old, abandoned mill that dates back to the 19th century. The mill has long been a source of local legends, including the tale of a phantom that haunts the area. When Emma and her friends set out for a multi-day hike, they planned to camp near Old Mill Creek, drawn by its scenic charm and the promise of solitude. They arrived in the early afternoon and set up their campsite near the creek, excited to explore the old mill later. As dusk approached, they made their way to the mill, which stood silent and imposing against the fading light. The mill had fallen into disrepair, with ivy creeping over its crumbling walls and a rotting wheel that had long ceased to turn. The group found it intriguing but didn't sense anything out of the ordinary. That night, the temperature dropped suddenly, and a thick fog began to roll in from the creek. The fog was so dense that it obscured their view of the surrounding forest. As they sat around the campfire, they began to hear strange noises coming from the direction of the mill, clanking metal, distant murmurs, and what sounded like the rhythmic thumping of machinery. One by one, the group members started seeing a shadowy figure moving among the trees and around the old mill. The figure appeared to be dressed in old-fashioned clothing and seemed to be working on something, though its features were indistinct. Emma and her friends tried to investigate, but the figure vanished whenever they approached. By morning, the fog had lifted, and the strange occurrences seemed to fade away. They found that their campsite had been disturbed, food containers were overturned, and their gear was scattered. They discovered old tools and machinery parts near the mill, which they hadn't noticed the night before. When they returned home, they learned about the mill's history. It had once been operated by a man who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Local lore spoke of his spirit haunting the area, searching for something lost in the fog of time. Emma and her friends couldn't shake the feeling that they had encountered the phantom of Old Mill Creek, a restless soul forever tied to the abandoned mill. 12. The Cursed Trail of Black Hollow. Black Hollow is a secluded area of the Appalachian Trail known for its dense woods and eerie atmosphere. The trail through Black Hollow is rarely hiked, partly due to its reputation for strange occurrences and inexplicable phenomena. Jason, an avid hiker with a fascination for haunted places, decided to tackle Black Hollow despite the warnings. He was prepared for the challenging terrain but didn't expect to encounter anything supernatural. He set out alone, planning to complete the hike in one day. As Jason entered Black Hollow, he was struck by the dense canopy of trees that blocked out most of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight in the forest. The air was heavy and still, and Jason felt an inexplicable sense of foreboding. He pressed on, determined to reach the end of the trail. Around midday, Jason noticed a series of old, weathered markers along the trail, symbols and carvings that seemed out of place in the otherwise natural surroundings. He found them intriguing but didn't dwell on them. As evening approached, Jason began to feel increasingly uneasy. The forest seemed to close in around him, and he heard strange noises, whispers, distant cries, and the occasional snap of twigs. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and he noticed that the shadows around him seemed to move on their own. By nightfall, Jason was deep in Black Hollow, and the atmosphere had become oppressive. He set up camp and tried to get some rest, but the strange noises continued. He felt as though something or someone was trying to reach out to him from the darkness. At around midnight, Jason was startled awake by the sound of footsteps approaching his campsite. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, but when he looked outside, he saw nothing. The noises persisted throughout the night, accompanied by unsettling whispers and the feeling of unseen eyes on him. When morning came, Jason packed up and hurried out of Black Hollow, eager to leave the eerie woods behind. He later learned that the area had a dark history. Several hikers had reported similar experiences, and some had even vanished without a trace. The local legend spoke of a curse placed on the land by indigenous tribes meant to protect sacred sites from intruders. Jason's experience in Black Hollow left him with a profound sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that the trail was indeed cursed and that the forest held secrets far beyond the natural world. 13. The Forgotten Footprints. Alice and Tom were seasoned hikers who had heard whispers of a strange phenomenon along a remote stretch of the Appalachian Trail known as the Forgotten Footprints. According to local law, hikers who ventured into this area sometimes found mysterious footprints leading nowhere and experiencing unsettling occurrences that defied explanation. One autumn weekend, Alice and Tom decided to investigate the trail for themselves. They set out in the morning, excited but slightly apprehensive. The trail was beautiful but increasingly desolate as they progressed. The dense forest and fading light gave the area a surreal quality. By late afternoon, they reached a clearing where they decided to set up camp. As they prepared their campsite, Alice noticed something odd, fresh footprints in the soil that seemed to lead from the edge of the clearing, but then abruptly stopped. The footprints were small and bare, as though someone had walked there recently and vanished into thin air. Tom was skeptical but found the footprints intriguing. They continued to explore the area, but the only thing they discovered was an old, abandoned shelter that looked as if it had been deserted for years. They returned to their camp, brushing off the unsettling discovery as a quirk of the trail. That night, the atmosphere grew increasingly eerie. Alice and Tom heard strange noises, muffled footsteps, distant whispers, and the occasional rustle of leaves as if someone, or something, was moving around their campsite. At one point, Alice saw a shadowy figure near the edge of the clearing, but when she called out, it vanished. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, they decided to pack up and leave early. As they hiked out, they found more of the mysterious footprints along the trail, always appearing and then vanishing without explanation. They learned later that the forgotten footprints were believed to be the marks of lost souls or restless spirits eternally wandering the woods. 14. The Enigmatic Lantern. David and Megan were avid hikers who relished the challenge of exploring less traveled sections of the Appalachian Trail. They had heard about a segment known for its mysterious occurrences, particularly involving an enigmatic lantern that supposedly appeared to hikers at night. One chilly autumn evening, they set out to explore this segment. They arrived at their campsite early and planned to hike the trail in the dark to try to catch a glimpse of the legendary lantern. As night fell, the forest became shrouded in darkness, with only the headlamps providing light. Around midnight, as they ventured deeper into the woods, they saw a faint light flickering in the distance. The light resembled an old-fashioned lantern swinging gently, illuminating the surrounding trees with a ghostly glow. They followed the light, intrigued and a bit apprehensive. As they approached, the lantern's light grew brighter, but they could see no one carrying it. The light seemed to float just above the ground, casting eerie shadows that danced along the trees. David and Megan followed the lantern for what felt like hours, but it never seemed to get any closer. Each time they thought they were nearing it, the light would move farther away. Eventually, the lantern's light began to fade, and the forest grew dark once again. They felt an overwhelming sense of isolation and began to hurry back to their campsite. When they returned, they found their gear scattered and their tent disturbed, as if someone or something had been there while they were away. The next morning, they learned that the lantern was part of a local legend about a spectral figure who roamed the woods, guiding lost souls or luring hikers to their doom. Some believed it was the spirit of a lighthouse keeper who had perished long ago, still seeking to guide those who wandered into the darkness. David and Megan left the trail with a sense of unease. Their encounter with the enigmatic lantern, a haunting reminder of the mysteries that linger in the wilderness. 15. The Cursed Campsite. Ben and Laura were seasoned hikers who prided themselves on their ability to tackle challenging trails. They decided to explore a remote section of the Appalachian Trail known for its scenic beauty, but also rumored to have a cursed campsite. According to local legends, anyone who camped there would experience a series of increasingly bizarre and terrifying events. When they arrived at the campsite, they found it to be eerily quiet, surrounded by dense forest and overgrown vegetation. The site had a strange, unsettling feeling, but they set up their camp and tried to dismiss their apprehensions. They were eager to enjoy the tranquility of the area. As night fell, the forest grew dark, and an unsettling silence enveloped the campsite. Around midnight, Ben was awoken by the sound of footsteps outside their tent. He assumed it was animals or perhaps another hiker, but when he checked, he saw nothing. The footsteps continued, becoming more pronounced and rhythmic. Laura woke up to the sound of whispers that seemed to come from all directions. The whispers were unintelligible, but had an urgent, pleading quality. She tried to calm herself, attributing the sounds to the wind or her imagination. The following night, the disturbances grew more intense. Their food supplies were mysteriously disturbed, and they found strange symbols carved into the trees around their campsite. The whispers became louder and more insistent, and the footsteps grew closer, as if someone or something was circling their tent. On the third night, things took a more sinister turn. They'd both had nightmares of being chased through the forest by shadowy figures. When they woke up, their tent was partially shredded, and their gear was scattered around the campsite as if it had been ransacked. Desperate to leave, Ben and Laura packed up and left the cursed campsite as quickly as possible. They learned later that the site had a dark history involving a group of hikers who had vanished without a trace years earlier. Locals believed that the area was cursed, and those who stayed there would experience the same eerie and terrifying phenomena as the missing hikers. 16. The Whispering Pines. Jessica and Mark were adventurous hikers who decided to explore a secluded section of the Appalachian Trail known as the Whispering Pines. The area was famous for its towering pine trees and the legends of strange, disembodied whispers that could be heard among the branches. They set out early in the morning and hiked through the dense pine forest, enjoying the peaceful scenery. However, as the sun began to set, the forest took on a different character. The whispers started, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to drift through the trees. The sounds were unnerving but subtle enough that they could easily be dismissed as the wind or their imagination. As darkness fell, the whispers grew louder and more persistent. Jessica and Mark set up camp, but the whispers continued, now mixed with the occasional rustling of branches and footsteps that seemed to move around their campsite. The sounds seemed to come from all directions, creating a disorienting and unsettling atmosphere. In the middle of the night, Jessica awoke to find the whispers becoming more coherent. She could make out words and phrases that seemed to be pleading for help or warning them to leave. Mark, who was still awake, tried to investigate the sounds but found nothing unusual. The whispers continued to escalate, becoming increasingly frantic and desperate. Jessica and Mark felt an overwhelming sense of dread and decided to leave their campsite in the middle of the night. As they packed up, the whispers grew louder and they felt as though they were being followed. When they finally made it back to civilization, they learned that the Whispering Pines had a dark history. The area was once the site of a tragic event involving a group of hikers who had become lost and perished in the forest. The whispers were believed to be the restless spirits of those who had died, forever trapped in the pines and calling out for help. Jessica and Mark's experience left them with a deep sense of unease, a reminder of the eerie and inexplicable phenomena that can occur in the remote corners of the Appalachian Trail. 17. The Eerie Echoes of Cedar Ridge. Sarah and Jake were avid hikers who had heard about the eerie echoes that were said to haunt Cedar Ridge, a remote and less traveled section of the Appalachian Trail. Legends spoke of disembodied voices and strange phenomena experienced by those who ventured too close to the ridge. Excited by the challenge and the mystery, they set out to explore Cedar Ridge on a crisp autumn afternoon. The trail was beautiful but increasingly isolated as they ascended. By evening, they reached a clearing with a panoramic view of the surrounding forest, a perfect spot to set up camp. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and a thick fog rolled in, shrouding the area in an otherworldly atmosphere. Sarah and Jake made a campfire and settled in, but they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Strange echoes began to emanate from the surrounding woods, distant voices that seemed to be repeating their own words, but distorted and unintelligible. As the night progressed, the echoes grew more pronounced. It was as if the forest was mimicking their conversations, but with an eerie twist. The voices began to mimic their names and personal details, growing louder and more frantic. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, creating a disorienting and unsettling experience. Sarah decided to investigate the source of the echoes and ventured into the foggy darkness. She followed the sound of her own voice echoing back at her, but each time she thought she was getting closer, the echoes would move farther away. Jake, feeling a growing sense of dread, tried to call her back, but his voice was swallowed by the eerie echoes. When Sarah returned to the campsite, she found Jake visibly shaken. He had experienced the echoes calling out to him in a threatening tone. They decided to pack up and leave immediately, feeling that the ridge held a malevolent presence. Later, they learned that Cedar Ridge had a history of strange occurrences. The area was rumored to be haunted by the spirits of people who had once lived in the nearby settlements and had met tragic ends. The echoes were believed to be residual energies of those lost souls, endlessly repeating their final moments. 18. The Ghostly Stranger of Sunset Trail. Emily and Ryan were enthusiastic hikers who decided to tackle Sunset Trail, a scenic but remote section of the Appalachian Trail known for its dramatic sunsets and legends of a ghostly figure that roamed the area. The trail had a reputation for being beautiful but unnervingly quiet, with a few hikers reporting sightings of a mysterious stranger. They set out early in the morning, hoping to reach the trail's scenic overlook by sunset. The hike was strenuous, but the views were breathtaking. As they approached the overlook, they noticed a lone figure standing at the edge, silhouetted against the setting sun. The figure was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with a wide-brimmed hat that obscured its face. Emily and Ryan called out to the figure, but it didn't respond. They assumed it was another hiker who preferred solitude and decided to continue their hike. As dusk fell, the figure was still there, unmoving. Emily and Ryan felt a chill despite the warm evening. They tried to get a closer look, but the figure seemed to vanish as they approached. They looked around but found no sign of anyone else on the trail. That night, they camped near the overlook, but their rest was disturbed by unsettling occurrences. They heard faint footsteps around their campsite and saw shadows moving in the corner of their vision. The ghostly figure seemed to reappear at intervals, standing silently at the edge of their campsite, watching them. In the morning, Emily and Ryan found that their gear had been moved and their food supply scattered. They packed up quickly and left the area, feeling an eerie sense of being followed. They later discovered that Sunset Trail had a legend of a ghostly stranger who had been seen by hikers over the years, a spirit of someone who had disappeared in the area long ago. The ghostly figure was believed to be searching for something lost or perhaps seeking companionship in the solitude of the trail. Emily and Ryan's encounter left them with a haunting memory of the ghostly stranger and the unsettling presence they had felt on Sunset Trail. 19. The Vanishing Cabin. Megan and Kevin were seasoned hikers who had heard rumors about a cabin that mysteriously appeared and vanished along the Appalachian Trail. The cabin was said to offer shelter to weary travelers, only to disappear without a trace, leaving those who found it bewildered and unsettled. Intrigued by the legend, Megan and Kevin set out on a late autumn hike, determined to find the elusive cabin. They'd followed a lesser-known trail that was rumored to lead to the area where the cabin was occasionally spotted. The trail was remote and overgrown, adding to the sense of mystery and anticipation. After a long day of hiking, they set up camp in a clearing. As night fell, they noticed a faint light in the distance. They followed the light, hoping it might lead them to the cabin. To their surprise, they found an old, rustic cabin, its windows glowing warmly and invitingly. The cabin seemed well preserved but appeared to be abandoned. They entered and found it furnished with old-fashioned but comfortable items, wooden furniture, a fireplace with a crackling fire, and shelves stocked with supplies. The atmosphere was cozy, but there was an unsettling sense of being watched. As they settled in, Megan and Kevin noticed strange occurrences. Items moved on their own, and the fire in the fireplace seemed to flicker unnaturally. They heard footsteps outside and whispers that seemed to come from the walls. Despite the discomfort, they decided to stay the night. When they woke up the next morning, the cabin was gone. The clearing where it had been was now empty, with no trace of the structure or the fire. Their gear and supplies were scattered around as if the cabin had never existed. They searched the area but found no evidence of the cabin's presence. Back home, Megan and Kevin learned that the cabin was part of a local legend. It was said to be a phantom structure that appeared to those who were lost or in need of help, only to vanish once its purpose was fulfilled. The legend spoke of the cabin being a guardian of the trail, offering temporary shelter to those who might otherwise be lost forever. 20. The Haunting of Devil's Backbone. Rachel and Tom were avid hikers who decided to tackle the challenging Devil's Backbone section of the Appalachian Trail. This area was known for its steep ridges and dramatic views, but it also had a reputation for unsettling encounters and ghostly apparitions. The hike began in bright, sunny weather, but as they reached the Devil's Backbone, the atmosphere changed. The ridge was shrouded in mist, and the temperature dropped unexpectedly. They set up camp at a small clearing with a breathtaking view of the surrounding mountains. As night fell, the mist grew thicker, and a chilling wind blew through the area. Rachel and Tom noticed strange lights moving in the distance and heard faint, mournful sounds carried by the wind. They dismissed the noises as the wind playing tricks on them and tried to get some rest. In the middle of the night, Rachel woke to find the clearing illuminated by an eerie bluish light. She saw ghostly figures moving among the trees, their forms indistinct and fleeting. The figures seemed to be searching for something or someone, their movements slow and deliberate. Tom woke up and saw the same figures, and the two of them decided to investigate. They followed the apparitions into the mist but found no trace of them. The figures seemed to vanish whenever they approached, leaving behind only the eerie light and the sound of mournful wails. Feeling unnerved, Rachel and Tom decided to pack up and leave. As they left the area, they encountered other hikers who had experienced similar phenomena: ghostly lights, mysterious figures, and an overwhelming sense of dread. They later learned that Devil's Backbone had a dark history. It was said to be haunted by the spirits of hikers who had perished in the treacherous terrain. The apparitions were believed to be the restless souls of those who had met their end along the ridge, forever wandering in search of peace. Rachel and Tom's experience left them with a lasting sense of unease, a reminder of the ghostly presence that lingered along Devil's Backbone and the mysteries that the Appalachian Trail held. 21. The Phantom Campfire. Ellen and Greg were experienced hikers who enjoyed exploring lesser-known sections of the Appalachian Trail. One evening, they decided to camp at a remote site known as Misty Hollow, a place reputed for its strange occurrences and ghostly legends. As they set up their campsite, they noticed an old, partially collapsed fire ring nearby. The area seemed abandoned, but there was something unsettling about the place. The sky was clear and the air was crisp, but an uneasy feeling settled over them as they started their campfire. Later in the evening, as they sat by their fire, they saw a flickering light in the distance, another campfire, seemingly located in the woods beyond their campsite. They assumed it was another hiker and decided to investigate. As they approached, the light grew brighter, but when they reached the spot where they expected to find the fire, it suddenly disappeared. Confused but intrigued, Ellen and Greg returned to their campsite. The same flickering light appeared again, this time closer and more intense. They could hear the crackling of a fire and faint, indistinct voices. It felt as if someone or something was having a gathering just out of sight. Despite their curiosity, they felt an increasing sense of dread. When they tried to follow the light once more, it vanished entirely, leaving them in the dark. The voices faded and the crackling sound stopped abruptly. They returned to their campsite, only to find their own fire had dimmed and their food supplies disturbed. That night, they heard the sounds of a campfire and distant laughter but saw no one. The following morning, they found no evidence of anyone else having been there. The fire ring they had seen earlier seemed older and more weathered than before. Upon returning home, they discovered that Misty Hollow was rumored to be haunted by the spirits of hikers who had once camped there but had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The phantom campfire was said to be a residual haunt, replaying the final moments of those lost souls. 22. The Weeping Woman of Pine Ridge. Tom and Alice were adventurous hikers who chose to explore Pine Ridge, a section of the Appalachian Trail known for its striking landscapes and eerie legends. Pine Ridge was rumored to be haunted by a weeping woman, a ghostly figure said to wander the trails in search of something lost. They set out early in the morning, excited to experience the beauty of Pine Ridge. The hike was challenging but rewarding, with stunning views of the surrounding forest. As the sun began to set, they reached a small clearing with a scenic overlook where they decided to camp. As night fell, the temperature dropped and a thick fog rolled in, shrouding the area in an eerie mist. They began to hear soft, sorrowful crying coming from the direction of the forest. The cries grew louder and more intense, accompanied by the sound of footsteps moving through the fog. Tom and Alice tried to ignore the sounds, attributing them to the wind or perhaps an animal. However, the crying continued, growing increasingly distressing. They could hear the distinct sound of someone sobbing and calling out for help, but they couldn't see anyone through the dense fog. Feeling unnerved, they decided to investigate the source of the cries. As they ventured into the mist, they saw a faint, ghostly figure moving among the trees, a woman dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her face obscured by the fog. She seemed to be searching for something, her sobs echoing through the forest. When they tried to approach the figure, she vanished into the mist. They returned to their campsite, only to find that their gear had been disturbed and their food supplies were scattered. The cries and footsteps continued throughout the night, creating an unsettling atmosphere. The following morning, they learned that Pine Ridge had a local legend about a woman who had lost her way in the forest and perished in the fog. Her spirit was said to wander the trails, eternally searching for something she had lost and calling out for help. Tom and Alice's experience left them with a haunting memory of the weeping woman and the eerie atmosphere of Pine Ridge, a reminder of the restless spirits that could be found along the Appalachian Trail. 23. The Enchanted Meadow. Laura and Mark were enthusiastic hikers who decided to explore a lesser-known section of the Appalachian Trail known as the Enchanted Meadow. The area was reputed for its breathtaking beauty, but also for the strange and unexplained events that hikers had reported experiencing. As they hiked through the dense forest and emerged into the meadow, they were struck by its otherworldly beauty. The meadow was lush with vibrant wildflowers and surrounded by tall, ancient trees that seemed to hum with an eerie energy. The sunlight filtering through the branches created a magical atmosphere. They set up camp in the meadow, eager to enjoy the serene surroundings. As night fell, the atmosphere shifted. The once vibrant colors of the meadow became muted under the moonlight, and a strange, almost hypnotic fog began to roll in from the edges of the field. While sitting by their campfire, Laura and Mark began to hear faint, melodious music drifting through the fog. The music was soothing but had an otherworldly quality, as though it were coming from a distant, enchanted place. They tried to locate the source but found nothing. As the night progressed, the fog thickened and the music grew louder. The meadow seemed to come alive with strange lights that floated just above the ground. These lights danced around them, casting eerie, shifting shadows. The music also seemed to be accompanied by whispers that grew more distinct, though still unintelligible. Feeling both intrigued and uneasy, Laura and Mark decided to explore the source of the lights and music. As they ventured deeper into the fog, the lights seemed to guide them toward a circle of stones in the center of the meadow. The stones were arranged in a perfect circle, and within it, they found a small, ancient altar covered in symbols and strange markings. When they approached the altar, the music and lights abruptly ceased. The fog began to dissipate, and the meadow returned to its normal, tranquil state. They'd hurried back to their campsite, feeling an unsettling presence as they left the circle of stones behind. The next morning, they learned that the Enchanted Meadow was believed to be a place of ancient, mystical significance. The music and lights were said to be manifestations of the meadow's magic, drawing in those who ventured too close to the sacred site. The local legend spoke of an ancient ritual space where the veil between the natural and supernatural worlds was thin. 24. The Lost Trail of Hollow Creek. Jenna and Kyle were avid hikers who decided to tackle Hollow Creek, a section of the Appalachian Trail known for its rugged terrain and eerie legends. The trail was less traveled and had a reputation for mysterious disappearances and strange occurrences. They started their hike in the early morning, eager to experience the rugged beauty of Hollow Creek. The trail was challenging, with steep inclines and dense undergrowth. As they ventured deeper into the forest, they began to notice that the trail markers were becoming less frequent and harder to follow. As night approached, they found a small clearing with a natural spring, which seemed like a good place to set up camp. The clearing was isolated, surrounded by dense trees and the sound of flowing water. They made a campfire and settled in for the night. In the dead of night, Jenna woke up to find that Kyle was missing. The campfire had gone out, and the clearing was shrouded in darkness. She called out for him, but there was no response. The silence was oppressive, and the only sound was the distant rush of the spring. Jenna ventured into the darkness, using her flashlight to search for Kyle. As she walked through the dense forest, she began to see strange, ghostly figures moving among the trees, shadowy forms that seemed to be watching her. The figures whispered in an unintelligible language and appeared to be leading her deeper into the forest. After hours of searching, Jenna stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The cabin was in disrepair, with broken windows and a rotting roof. Inside, she found Kyle, unconscious but alive, lying on the floor. When Kyle woke up, he had no memory of how he ended up in the cabin. They quickly packed up and left Hollow Creek, feeling a deep sense of unease. They'd later learned that the area had a dark history. Several hikers had disappeared in the woods, and their bodies were found in mysterious circumstances. The ghostly figures and whispers were believed to be the spirits of those who had vanished, eternally searching for those who wandered too close to the cursed trail. Jenna and Kyle's experience left them with a haunting memory of Hollow Creek and the eerie, supernatural presence that seemed to linger in the shadows of the forest. 25. The Haunting of Bramble Ridge. Hannah and Luke were avid hikers who set out to explore Bramble Ridge, a remote and rugged section of the Appalachian Trail known for its dramatic landscapes and unsettling history. The ridge was rumored to be haunted by the spirits of those who had perished there under mysterious circumstances. As they hiked up the ridge, they noticed the landscape growing increasingly desolate. The trail was overgrown, and the air felt unusually heavy. They'd reached a small clearing at the top with a breathtaking view, but also an unsettling sense of isolation. They decided to set up camp there. As night fell, the atmosphere became even more eerie. The wind howled through the trees, and the temperature dropped suddenly. Strange sounds began to emanate from the forest, distant, mournful cries, and the occasional rustle of leaves, as if something was moving nearby. Around midnight, Hannah and Luke heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching their campsite. They assumed it was another hiker and called out, but there was no response. The footsteps continued, growing louder and more deliberate, as if someone was circling their tent. Feeling uneasy, they decided to investigate. As they ventured into the darkness with their flashlights, they saw shadowy figures moving among the trees. The figures seemed to be watching them, their forms shifting and flickering in the beam of their flashlights. The eerie cries grew louder, and the shadows seemed to become more defined. When they returned to their campsite, they found their gear scattered and their food supplies disturbed. The unsettling atmosphere persisted throughout the night, with the cries and footsteps continuing until dawn. The next day, they learned that Bramble Ridge had a dark history. It was rumored to be the site of a tragic event involving a group of hikers who had vanished without a trace. The spirits of those lost souls were said to haunt the ridge, their restless spirits eternally searching for a way out. Hannah and Luke left Bramble Ridge with a deep sense of unease, their experience a chilling reminder of the supernatural presence that lingered in the desolate wilderness. 26. The Silent Watcher of Misty Falls. Sarah and Alex were experienced hikers who ventured to Misty Falls, a remote area of the Appalachian Trail known for its beautiful yet eerie waterfall. The falls were rumored to be haunted by a silent, watchful presence that was said to appear to those who ventured too close. They arrived at Misty Falls in the late afternoon, eager to experience its natural beauty. The falls were stunning, cascading down a rocky cliff into a crystal-clear pool. The area around the falls was shrouded in mist, adding to its ethereal quality. As night fell, they set up camp near the falls. The mist thickened, and the area grew darker. They could hear the constant, soothing sound of the waterfall, but an unsettling feeling began to settle over them. They felt as though they were being watched. In the middle of the night, Sarah woke up to find a figure standing at the edge of the pool. The figure was tall and shadowy, with no discernible features. It stood perfectly still, gazing silently at the falls. Sarah tried to wake Alex, but when she looked back, the figure had vanished. Alex, now awake, was skeptical but agreed to investigate. They approached the pool, but found nothing unusual. The figure's presence left them with a sense of dread that lingered throughout the night. They could hear soft, whispering voices carried by the mist, adding to their growing unease. The next morning, they discovered that Misty Falls had a local legend about a silent guardian who watched over the falls. The guardian was said to be a spirit that protected the area from those who might seek to harm it. The silent figure was believed to be a manifestation of this guardian, appearing only to those who came too close to its sacred site. Sarah and Alex left Misty Falls with a haunting memory of the silent watcher and the eerie atmosphere that surrounded the falls, a reminder of the supernatural presence that lurked in the mist. 27. The Enigma of Blackwood Hollow. Ella and Max, seasoned hikers with a taste for adventure, decided to explore Blackwood Hollow, a lesser-known section of the Appalachian Trail with a reputation for strange occurrences. Locals spoke of a mysterious energy in the hollow that caused hikers to lose their way and experience disorienting phenomena. The trail into Blackwood Hollow was overgrown and rarely used, adding to the sense of isolation. Ella and Max were intrigued by the challenge and set up camp near a small clearing surrounded by dense woods. The day was warm and clear, but as night approached, a heavy fog began to roll in, obscuring their surroundings. As they sat by their campfire, they noticed that the fog seemed to move and swirl unnaturally. Strange, almost hypnotic patterns emerged in the mist, and they felt an odd sense of being watched. The atmosphere grew increasingly unsettling, with the fog becoming thicker and the temperature dropping suddenly. Around midnight, they began to hear faint, eerie music drifting through the fog. The melody was haunting and seemed to come from all directions. They tried to trace the source of the music, but found nothing in the thickening mist. The music grew louder and more frantic, and they could hear indistinct voices speaking in an unknown language. Ella and Max decided to follow the music, which seemed to lead them deeper into the hollow. As they ventured further, they noticed that the landscape was changing. The trees appeared to shift and warp, and the familiar trail markers had disappeared. The fog seemed to close in around them, creating a disorienting and surreal experience. After what felt like hours of wandering, they'd found themselves back at their campsite, though it seemed strangely altered. Their gear was scattered, and their supplies were missing. The eerie music and voices continued until dawn, when the fog finally began to lift. The next day, they'd learned that Blackwood Hollow was known for its disorienting properties. Hikers who ventured too deep into the hollow often experienced strange phenomena, such as the shifting landscape and unsettling music. The hollow was said to be a place where the boundaries between reality and the supernatural were thin, creating an enigmatic and unsettling experience for those who dared to explore it. 28. The Shadow of Echo Ridge. Jason and Lily, adventurous hikers with a love for the unexplained, chose to hike Echo Ridge, a remote section of the Appalachian Trail known for its eerie acoustics and ghostly legends. Echo Ridge was famous for its perfectly reflective rock formations, which created unsettling and haunting echoes that could be heard for miles. They set out early in the morning, excited to experience the unique acoustics of Echo Ridge. The hike was challenging, with steep climbs and narrow paths, but they reached the ridge in the late afternoon. The ridge offered stunning views and the eerie echoes they had heard about. As they explored the ridge, they noticed the echoes took on a strange quality. Sounds seemed to be distorted and amplified in unsettling ways. The echoes would repeat their conversations but with a disturbing twist, sometimes mimicking their voices with a sinister tone. As dusk approached, the atmosphere became increasingly unsettling. The echoes grew louder and more chaotic, and the surrounding landscape took on an eerie quality. Shadows seemed to move and shift unnaturally, and the echoes began to mimic unsettling and disembodied voices. When night fell, Jason and Lily set up camp near a large rock formation known for its strong echoes. The echoes continued, growing more pronounced and erratic. They began to hear footsteps and whispers that seemed to be coming from all around them. The shadows seemed to come alive, shifting and morphing into unsettling shapes. In the middle of the night, they saw a dark, shadowy figure moving among the rocks. The figure was indistinct and seemed to be blending into the shadows. They could hear the figure's footsteps echoing in all directions, creating an overwhelming sense of dread. Jason and Lily decided to leave the ridge, feeling that the echoes and shadows were becoming too intense. As they packed up, the shadowy figure seemed to follow them. Its presence felt even as they left the area. The next day, they learned that Echo Ridge had a reputation for unsettling acoustics and ghostly apparitions. The echoes were believed to be the result of supernatural forces, amplifying and distorting the sounds of those who ventured too close. The shadowy figure was thought to be a manifestation of the restless spirits that haunted the ridge, eternally trapped in the echoes of their final moments. Jason and Lily's experience left them with a haunting memory of Echo Ridge, a reminder of the eerie and supernatural phenomena that could be encountered along the Appalachian Trail. 29. The Ghostly Lantern of Long Creek. Emily and Tom, experienced hikers with a penchant for the supernatural, decided to explore Long Creek, a remote area of the Appalachian Trail known for its legends of a ghostly lantern. The lantern was said to appear to those who ventured too close to the creek after dark, leading them astray or causing them to become lost. They arrived at Long Creek in the late afternoon, excited to experience its reputed mystery. The creek was serene, with clear, gently flowing water and a canopy of trees that cast long shadows as the sun began to set. They set up camp near the creek, eager to witness the legendary lantern. As night fell, the temperature dropped and the area became enveloped in darkness. The only light came from their campfire and the distant glow of the moon. They were soon joined by a soft, eerie glow that appeared on the opposite side of the creek. The glow resembled a lantern, swaying gently as if carried by an unseen hand. Intrigued, Emily and Tom decided to investigate. They crossed the creek using a makeshift bridge and followed the glow. As they approached, the lantern seemed to move away, leading them deeper into the woods. The surrounding forest became dense and dark, and the trail markers were few and far between. The lantern continued to lead them through the forest, but the deeper they went, the more disoriented they became. The glow seemed to flicker and vanish, only to reappear farther ahead. The sounds of the forest grew eerily silent, and an oppressive sense of dread began to settle over them. Eventually, they lost sight of the lantern and found themselves in a dense, unfamiliar part of the woods. They decided to retrace their steps, but found that the way back was no longer clear. The lantern reappeared briefly, but then disappeared completely. After hours of wandering, they managed to find their way back to their campsite by sheer luck. The lantern was gone, and the eerie feeling lifted with the dawn. They later learned that Long Creek was said to be haunted by the spirit of a former resident who had perished in the area. The ghostly lantern was believed to be the spirit's way of guiding or misguiding travelers, leading them astray as it searched for something lost. 30. The Phantom Pack of Balsam Hollow. Jess and Claire were avid hikers who set out to explore Balsam Hollow, a secluded section of the Appalachian Trail known for its dense forests and mysterious occurrences. Balsam Hollow was rumored to be haunted by a phantom pack of animals that roamed the area, their ghostly forms said to appear at night. They arrived at Balsam Hollow in the afternoon and began their hike through the dense woods. The forest was beautiful but had an eerie quality, with the trees standing tall and silent. As they set up camp for the night, they heard distant howls that seemed to echo through the hollow. As darkness fell, the howls grew louder and more intense. Jess and Claire could hear the sound of footsteps and rustling leaves, as if something or someone was moving around their campsite. The sounds grew more pronounced, and they felt a growing sense of unease. In the middle of the night, they saw shadowy figures moving through the trees. The figures resembled a pack of animals, but their forms were indistinct and seemed to blend into the darkness. The phantom pack circled their campsite, their howls and growls creating an unsettling atmosphere. Jess and Claire decided to investigate the source of the sounds. They ventured into the darkness with their flashlights, but the figures seemed to vanish whenever they approached. The sounds continued, growing more frenetic and chaotic. When they returned to their campsite, they found their gear disturbed and their food supply scattered. The phantom pack's howls and growls continued throughout the night, creating an oppressive and unnerving atmosphere. The next morning, they learned that Balsam Hollow